Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Shoreline Shells Block of the Month and Quilt Sew Along. I'm so happy that you're joining us on this fun foundation paper piecing journey. Today, I'm going to give you some tips as you begin to make your Shoreline Shells quilt blocks, and specifically block 1, an abstract tulip shell. If you're new to foundation paper piecing, or if you're a bit rusty, be sure to refer to the general foundation paper piecing tips included in the pattern, as well as my free mini class videos. There's one on general foundation paper piecing and one on tiny foundation paper piecing. The links can be found below. I highly recommend checking it out, especially if you're new to paper piecing or if you've had some challenges with this technique in the past. Also, what we review today in this video is applicable to all of the blocks, so you may want to come back to this video while you're working on future blocks as well. Before we begin, you'll want to first decide which version of the Shoreline Shells blocks you're going to make. One's for the circle arrangement or one's for the grid arrangement. Be sure to refer to the Shoreline Shells welcome packet. This was a link to a PDF that was emailed to you immediately after you registered. There's information in that packet to help you choose an arrangement if you're having a difficult time deciding. There's also coloring sheets for each options to help you choose and assign your fabric. In each of the arrangements, there's opportunities to customize your quilt even further, including adding additional sea glass to the center of the circle arrangement or optional irregular rounded corners to the grid arrangement. I'll go over some of the details about both of these alternatives later in this video. Let's get started. Once you decide which version of the block you're going to make, refer to page 1 in the pattern to find out which pattern pages you need to print for that specific block. For block 1, to make the circle option, I need just pattern pages 1 through 9. To make the grid layout, I need just pattern pages 10 through 17. When you're printing your pattern pages, make sure that your print settings are set to print at 100% or actual size. I can't stress this enough. Technology does really funky things and will often want to print a percentage or two smaller. If this happens, you may not know it until you finish your block, and your pieces might not fit together, and as they won't be the proper size. This is heartbreaking. It's really important to measure the 1-inch block on each page to confirm that it really does measure 1 inch exactly. So I just use my acrylic ruler on every page to make sure of this. I went ahead and I trimmed my paper pieces on the outer thinner lines. I like to use a rotary that I have dedicated for paper. But if you're more comfortable using scissors, again, I'd recommend your paper scissors, not your good fabric scissors. You can use those as well. I also like to save all of the scraps around the pieces. I then cut those up and use them as labels as I'm pre-cutting my fabric in a little bit. You'll see on each paper piece the block number and whether it's for the grid or the circle layout to help you. For each block, you'll also have to assemble some paper pieces and templates, similar to how you would if you were making a pattern for clothing. Let me show you how I like to cut and tape these pieces. What I'm about to describe is also mentioned in page 1 of your pattern. I first cut the pieces again on the outer, thinner, solid lines, and then I use the diagrams shown on page 1 of the pattern to know how to arrange the pieces. On the pieces that have dashed lines, if the dash appears on the right or on the bottom of the piece, I like to cut right on the dashed lines. If the dashed line appears on the top or on the left, I like to leave about 1/2 inch of paper beyond that dashed line. This helps when we're matching up the pieces. Let me show you what that looks like. So let's take K top and K bottom go together. And again, I can refer to page 1 in the instructions so I know how those go. So what I like to do is have, again, this one is cut right on the line. This has a little bit of extra. So there's an overlap of the paper, which I find makes it more rigid and a little bit less floppy and definitely more accurate. So I'm going to match up the ends, the dotted line, and then that X in the middle. The X is just there to help us, just to make sure everything on the paper is aligned as we're matching up. So once that's aligned, I then take some Scotch tape and I just tape that. I always put the Scotch tape on the printed side. I find that if I put it on the back side, eventually we'll be pressing on this side, the fabric will be here, and it may, if there's a little bit too hot, if the iron's a little bit too hot, the tape may melt to the fabric, but it won't do that if the fabric isn't touching. So I always tape on the printed side. You could see there's a little bit of an overlap, and again, that's what's going to make the template more accurate and nice and rigid and less floppy. So let me show you what it looks like when we have more than two pieces to join together. So here, again, I'm going to refer to my directions for how this end piece gets arranged. And according to my diagram and the pattern, it's N1, N2, and N3 goes down here. So again, on the left-hand side, I trimmed right on the dotted line, dashed line. On the left-hand sides of the piece, I left a little bit of overlap. And then on the bottom, I cut right on the dashed line. And on the top of this piece, I left a little bit, about a ½ inch. Could be a quarter of an inch. I have a tendency to do a ½ inch. So when there's more than two pieces, I generally like to join the paper pieces in horizontal rows. I'll show you what that looks like. And then join the rows together. So in this case, I'll join N1 to N2. Just going to align the dotted lines, the dashed lines, I should say, making sure that the lines continue. The X is in the middle, just as another added guide. And then I'll tape these together on the printed side. And then just like making a quilt, I'm going to join my next row together. There's only one piece in that row. I find it's easier if the line, and if there's any little overlaps, I can just trim those up here. I missed cutting that earlier, not a problem. I find that for me it's easier if to align if the dashed line that I cut on is closer to me and the overlap is further away, but that could just be me. See what works best for you, but I find this way it's a little bit easier. And then I could tape it. So one thing to note as we're assembling these, and again, they were designed this way, we're doing a little bit of more work, but the upside is you don't need a special printer to print out your templates. Everything fits on an 8.5 by 11. So once they're all joined with this little bit of prep, one thing to note is when we get to paper piecing, you're going to ignore these dashed lines. The dashed lines are only for joining, making these templates, and then we can just ignore them. So as an example, section 1, we're going to fill this entire section with one piece of fabric. We're just going to ignore that dashed line. We're going to treat this as one full section when we get to paper piecing. Staying organized often makes quilting a lot easier. For each block, for both the circle and the grid options, I included a key for you to tape or glue fabric swatches to. This makes it easy to stay organized and to know if you're using the right fabric in the right section on the paper. This is helpful whether you're using the chart to pre-cut your fabrics or not. You'll also notice that the charts have corresponding shading that is also in the paper piecing. If you're cutting and labeling your fabric according to the cutting diagrams, it's pretty easy to keep your fabrics organized and assigned. The sizes listed are approximately 3/4 of an inch bigger than the section that they need to cover. So if you're new to paper piecing, you may find that you need to cut your pieces a little bit bigger. If you're a more experienced paper piecer, you may find more efficient ways to cut your fabric. Whether you're using these cutting charts or not, I highly recommend paying attention to the notes in the cutting chart for each month's block, and that's called out in bold. So as an example, for block 1, if you are making the circle layout with the optional sea glass and you're using the same fabric for some of the sea glass as you are this shell, I recommend cutting the fabric pieces for the sea glass first and set those aside. If you're making the grid blocks specifically for grid layout 2, you'll notice that I recommend cutting the long strips required first. These are the strips once the block is paper pieced, again, for the grid layout 2 only, that go around the perimeter. I know it can be really enticing to jump into piecing, but make sure you refer to the pattern each month to avoid mistakes and headaches down the road. Depending on your printer, it may be challenging to see the shading differences between the shell and the background. So you may want to make a note with a pencil on the paper pieces before you start sewing, especially if you're not pre-cutting and labeling your fabric. If you're having a challenging time seeing the difference, you can always refer to the letters and numbers in the fabric cutting chart. They're listed below what the use is. So block background, or shell. One of the benefits of pre-cutting your fabric using the cutting chart is that you can just label as you cut. It takes the guesswork out of the shading and you could just grab your fabric pieces and sew. I'm going to give you some additional tips and info for the grid blocks in a moment, but first let's start with some details about the circle version of the blocks. If you're making the circle version of the blocks, I highly recommend cutting your fabric for your larger background templates before you begin paper piecing. You don't want to use up large pieces of your fabric and then not have enough to cover these. Plus, you can use the scraps around your background template to foundation paper piece with. In each pattern, you'll find a cutting diagram on page 2 for how I suggest you place these larger templates on your fabric. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So first, make sure that the unprinted side of your template, so the unprinted side, is touching the wrong side of the fabric. The printed side of the paper is essentially the back of our quilt, so we want the correct side of the fabric facing out. The way I cut the fabric for these larger pieces is first, I secure my paper template to the fabric using some water-soluble glue. See my recommendations below for what brands I use so they work well to secure the paper templates, but they don't leave remnants, paper remnants when I want to remove the template. So I'll go ahead and secure this. You can also use a pin. The pins are a little bit bulky though. So then once this is secure, I'll then carefully trim the fabric to the edge of the paper piece. So what I like to do, the thinner outer line is exactly 1/4 of an inch away from the thicker line. That's our seam allowance. I actually find it easier to use my ruler and the 1/4 inch guide on my acrylic ruler away. I match that on the thicker line. It's a little bit hard to match, I find, to match the edge of the ruler with the edge of the template with the shadow. So you can always use that as a guide. And then I'll go ahead and use my rotary cutter and cut those pieces out. Once they're cut out, I recommend leaving the paper attached to the fabric. You can always add a pin or two here to make it extra secure. And then just set those aside. I find that the paper template is a good guide later when I'm sewing the fabric piece to the rest of the blocks. Once you have your paper pieces prepared, you can then move on to sewing the paper pieces to the fabric to make the shells. Be sure to refer to each month's pattern. For block 1, you'll need paper pieces A through J to make the block for the circle layout. The shading for the circle option of the blocks is as follows. The sections for the shell are shaded in gray, and the background sections are unshaded. Before I start paper piecing, I like to organize my paper pieces according to diagram 1 in the pattern. Remember, we're looking at the back of the block, so the image is flipped or reversed. After you have your individual paper pieces complete, and the fabric is trimmed to the edge of the paper, you'll be ready to start joining your paper pieces together to have your shell come alive. To help you achieve precise alignments in all of the blocks, I've included symbols like dots and squares on the paper pieces. So here you could see a dot. On this piece, there's a square. So you'll be matching up symbols as you join the pieces. If there's just one symbol and not a matching one when you're joining pieces, you're going to ignore it for the time being. So as an example, one of the first pieces that you'll join together are A to B, and I can see a dot here, but not here. So I'm just going to ignore that for the time being, and then in a future step we'll be using it. So A and B gets joined together, and then later when C and D are together, I'll be matching up these dots. So again, if there's not a dot to match, just ignore it. Also, in a future video, I'm going to talk more about how I use pins to get really accurate alignments when joining pieces. Once you've sewn together your paper pieces and the background templates for the circle option, the block sizes will vary. The sizes are listed in the individual block patterns. The shapes of the blocks look a little funky, but when it comes time to sew all the blocks together to assemble the quilt top, no additional cutting or fabric is required, and the quilt top comes together quickly. These funky shapes of the overall outlines of the blocks all fit together and complete the circle. Once we get further along into the sew along, I'll be sending you the quilt top assembly instructions so you can sew your blocks together. Be sure to leave all of the paper on the blocks. This will help you save time later as you sew together the blocks to make the final quilt top. If you're making the optional sea glass center, be sure to refer to the second to last step of the pattern carefully. For many of the blocks, you won't be using background template Z. And block 1 is one of these blocks. Instead of using background template Z here at the top, you'll be using Shoreline Sea Glass 1, wedge 1, to complete the block. Let's talk about the grid option of the blocks now. As outlined in the welcome packet, there's 2 different grid layout options. Grid 1, where all of the blocks are the same size, 20.5 inches by 16.5 inches unfinished, or grid 2, where the block sizes vary. The way the quilts were designed for grid 1, shown here, is you'll add sashing between all of the quilt blocks and borders around the perimeter to complete the quilt. If you're making a quilt with all blocks designed for grid 2, when it comes time to sew all of your quilt blocks together to assemble the quilt top, no additional cutting or fabric is required, as the quilt top comes together quickly. Once we get further along in the sew along, I'll be sending you the quilt top assembly instructions for both of these grid options so you can sew your blocks together. As I mentioned earlier, whether you're using the cutting charts to pre-cut your fabric for the paper piecing portions of the block or not, make sure you pay attention to the notes in the cutting chart for each month's block that's called out in bold. There's important notes regardless of whether you're pre-cutting your fabric for foundation paper piecing or not. For block 1, if you're making a block specifically for the grid 2 layout, there are some background strips that you'll need to cut. Because these are fairly long, I recommend cutting these first before paper piecing so you don't run out of fabric. Also, you'll notice that I have a fabric efficiency tip. I often call this out in the cutting charts. So for block 1, if you want to recover some of your fabric for use elsewhere in this block, before cutting or sewing into anything else, I recommend cutting the fabric pieces needed for U1 and V1. You're going to attach it to your paper pieces and then sew if you're making the optional rounded corners. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're going to trim the fabric to the edges. You can then use these extra scraps for other block background sections in this block. Another option you'll have on your grid blocks is if you want your blocks to have crisp 90-degree corners or irregular rounded corners like shown here. You can make this decision at the last minute. If you would like your block to have the optional irregular rounded corners, then you'll foundation paper piece the unshaded sections on your grid paper pieces. If you plan on adding sashing and borders around your quilt blocks, I recommend using the same fabric so that your rounded corners match and blend. If you would like your block to have crisp 90-degree corners, good news, there's less piecing for you. What you'll do is you will not foundation paper piece these unshaded sections. You're going to make sure that the block background fabric in these sections, so in this case for you, it would be 1. You're going to make sure that that fabric extends into the unshaded sections and off the edge of the paper piece. If you're using the foundation paper piecing fabric cutting chart, I accounted for this and you already have it in your measurement. Once you have your paper pieces trimmed to the outer edge of the paper, you can dig into paper piecing. For block 1, you'll need paper pieces K through V. The shading for the grid option of the blocks is in the reverse of the circle layout. So for the grid, the sections for the shell are shaded in light gray. The sections for the block background are shaded in dark gray. And as we just talked about, the sections for the optional irregular corners are unshaded. As I mentioned earlier, depending on your printer, it may be challenging to see the difference between the shell and the background. So you may want to make a note on the paper pieces with a pencil before you start sewing, just to make sure you're grabbing the right fabric. If you're having a challenging time seeing the difference with your print, the way your printer prints, you can refer to the letters and the numbers in the fabric chart and see what category it's under. One of the benefits of pre-cutting your fabric using the cutting charts is that if you label as you cut, it takes the guesswork out of the shading. You could just grab your fabric pieces and sew. Before I start paper piecing, I like to organize my paper pieces according to diagram 7 in the pattern. Remember, we're looking at the back of the block, so the image is flipped or reversed. After you have your individual paper pieces complete and the fabric is all trimmed to the edge of the paper, you'll be ready to start joining your paper pieces. As I mentioned earlier, to help you achieve precise alignments in all of the blocks, I've included symbols like dots or circles and squares. You'll be matching up the symbols as you join pieces. If there's only one symbol and not a matching one when you're joining a piece, ignore it for the time being and you'll use that symbol as a guide when joining additional paper pieces in a future step. So as an example, early on you're going to match and sew together M to N, and here you could see on M there's a dot, but on N there isn't. That's not a mistake, just ignore it for now. Later on when M and N is joined, you're going to be using that dot as a guide to join up L. In a future video, I'm going to talk more about how I use pins to get really accurate alignments. I can't wait to see your first block come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with even more tips. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments or something that you'd like me to show in a future video, please let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to share your progress on Instagram using the Shoreline Shells hashtags found on the pattern so we can check out what you're working on. Or I'd love for you to email me photos of your block. My email address can be found in the pattern. See you next month and happy sewing!